couple of very special guests here to offer their insights into the races as well. KPRC political analyst Judge Ed Emmett is here, as is Dr. Brandon Rottinghouse from University of Houston, political science professor. Both of us here to talk about elections. This is the kind of stuff that you get hyperventilating about.
I love it. It's like a Super
And this was
Bowl.
your life for so many years. What happens on election night? Is this, the juices go up just a bit?
No, this is much more relaxing. Thank you very much. It's fun to be on this side.
Yeah, and what have you noticed about some of the trends that we've been looking at so far?
Well, the one thing, whenever you talk about city elections in the city of Houston, is how low the turnout is. I went back and checked. We were talking before the show. 1973, Fred Hoffines and Dick Gottlieb in the runoff had 240,000 votes. And the city of Houston was not anywhere near as populated as it is today.
Yeah.
So just the fact that so few people participate, it's really bothersome.
It is bothersome, and I guess a lot of times when we talk about the expectation, all the candidates know it's all about get out the vote.
It is, and it could be that the few hundred votes is the difference between making a runoff and not and winning a not. So that's a margin that's hard to make predictions about. But with a nonpartisan election and with it being effectively in an off cycle, people aren't that attentive to what's going on.
And particularly in some of these races where you've got 12, 15 candidates,
Yeah.
a familiar name, a good sounding name, those pop up and you go, where'd that come from? Well, people go vote for mayor, and while there they pick some names for these other offices.
Yeah.
It's a problem.
You said nonpartisan, is it really though? I mean, it's so many times people go, and especially now because we are in so different silos politically. If they know somebody's a Republican and they're Republican, whether it's a partisan race or not, they'll go ahead and do that.
Well, I'm old enough to remember in Harris County particularly, and in the state of Texas years ago, it was a two-party state, but it was conservative Democrats and liberal Democrats. And they went at each other every bit as hard. I mean, you had Harris County Democrats run by a lady named Billy Carr, and then you had the more conservative faction with the Squatty Lions of the world. And so city elections played out the same way back then. And in fact, that Fred Hoffines election, New York Times ran a big banner story, liberal elected Houston mayor. And so, yeah, but that fight was just as vigorous then.
We're going to be here for another hour and a half here or so, but there's a lot going on here. You may know that poll places close at 7 o'clock. We do have information from the early voting, so we can look at some of that, and we can talk about what some of the early voting means, because there's different people who vote in the early votings and mail-ins than do the other things. One of the biggest races happening tonight, the race for Houston mayor, and this is the early, and remember, this is the early voting numbers, so we're talking about 49%, 29%, Sylvester Turner to Tony Busby, and Bill King 13%, and Dwight Boykins 6%. Those numbers are close to what the pre-voting polling was indicating they would be.
Well, you're looking at me, so I'll answer. For Mayor Turner, that's a really good number. And the reason is the early vote includes a lot of the absentee ballots. If you're over 65, you get an absentee ballot by mail. So that will actually be skewed to the more conservative side. So if Mayor Turner's already at 49%, I think he's in for a good evening.
Your thoughts about that?
I agree. I think the fact that Turner has been in power and has got a machine to turn out people is going to give him the edge on election day. So it could be that it's an early enough night that he gets the outright win. I'm surprised by that. I thought for sure that you'd find enough other candidates taking away votes from him. But as it is, even Tony Busby's $10 million wasn't enough to build an apparatus to get the vote out.
And that's been one of the conversation pieces going on about what kind of role money was going to play in all of this. And there's a long way before this thing's over. But clearly, Tony Busby, no real political experience, and the voting record indicates no real voting experience either, who comes in, and money has gotten him into the number 2 spot over somebody like Bill King, who was very, very competitive the last time around.
Right. And, money buys you name ID.
Yeah.
But once you have name ID, then you have to do something with it. And you have to say, okay, this is why you got to elect me. And the other thing, I know you're talking about money, but looking at these results, Dwight Boykins has almost nothing showing for him, for his campaign. if anybody was going to cut into Mayor Turner's base, it would have been Councilmember Boykins. That doesn't seem to have happened.
Now, one of the things that he was counting on was to be able to do some of that. That was going to be the key to him being able to make inroads, if you will. Phil Archer is at the Turner headquarters right now, and let's check in with him. That's a watch party. I know that, Phil, you said earlier during the newscast that the folks down there at Turner's place were hoping they could have a victory party outright and be done with this before this evening's over. I don't know if you can you hear me, Phil? He can't hear me. Okay, well, let's work on that getting his communication back together there. And once we get that done, we'll go back to him. But we talk about how close this race was for Bill King a number of years ago. The only difference really has been that money of Tony Busby, it seems to me, in this process going forward.
And we were talking about just the nonpartisanness in quotes of the election, and I think the fact that you've got kind of partisan politics at the national level trickling down to Houston, where a lot of the relationship between Tony Busby and Donald Trump was made, not just in terms of the actual relationship, but also how he acts and how he might act when in power. So a lot of that, I think, was something that was negative for Busby and ended up hurting him a little bit.
I'd be curious to know how Sue Lovell did on this as well. Daniel, if we can pull up past the first four, that would be good to be able to look at, only because she was, as a former city council member, you would think that, of course, she got in late and really didn't do a whole lot of campaigning that I could see.
But it was almost, she might disagree with this, but it was almost like she just dropped out, particularly when you got to the debate stage. You didn't hear anything from Ms. Lovell, and she didn't make a big scene about not being included in debates. And frankly, I've asked some people, did she not want to be in the debates?
Well, no, you know what, though, behind the scenes, she was making the stink.
Okay.
Yeah, she was making the stink, but a lot of times the challenge was that they set, like the one that was on Channel 2, for example, they just said, hey, if you want to be in the debates, you got to show that you have $50,000 in whatever that money was. And when it came time for that, it wasn't there.
Yeah.
So that's why she's at 1% of the vote right now. So that really doesn't reflect very well for her at this point. Phil Archer is at the Turner headquarters right now. Phil, I understand you can hear us now.
Yep, loud and clear, 5 by 5.
Here you go, buddy. Hey, I know that you said earlier during the newscast that the Turner folk were hoping to have an outright just victory celebration and be done with this thing.
Right, well, that, of course, is the hope among Turner supporters, and they're starting to gather here at the Brown Convention Center, as you can see. I have to say, though, I was here 4 years ago for Sylvester Turner's first successful run for mayor, and there, at that time, seems to me, it was a little bigger crowd, a little more of a party atmosphere. That could have something to do with the slow vote count coming in tonight. We're hearing that hundreds of polls remained open to take care of voters who'd lined up before the 7 p.m. closing time. So the atmosphere right now is optimistic but subdued. We're hearing the mayor may be here any time now, and I'm sure that the room is going to brighten up considerably once that happens. Of course, Mayor Turner has a commanding lead in the recent polling coming into Election Day. Roughly 20-point lead over his nearest competitor, Tony Busby, but it's not clear if that's going to be enough to keep him out of a runoff. When we spoke with the mayor earlier today, he was confident he would win. His daughter, Ashley, arrived a little while ago, just beaming optimism.
4 years ago, I went from my dad just being a state representative, looking to take this seat that he's dreamed of his entire life. And now he's been in position. He's been the mayor for 4 years. I've seen him work so hard, so tirelessly, 7 days a week for the past 4 years. So it's just a different emotion going into this as him as the incumbent versus the first time when it's all so fresh and so new.
So Ashley is here. A number of elected officials, county and city elected officials are here. We're expecting the mayor to arrive shortly and expecting also to see this crowd grow as those vote counts come in. Reporting live at the Brown Convention Center, I'm Phil Archer, KPRC Channel 2 News.
All right, thank you very much, Phil. Tony Busby, of course, came out and just very early on said, hey, there's a guy who's in City Hall who's corrupt, and that was his campaign, and he obviously spent a lot of money to develop that persona, if you will. What does it say if these numbers continue to add up? You're saying that early numbers with the 49% are pretty positive for the mayor. What does it say about this community and the impact of money into a race if it doesn't? That's a lot of money being spent for no positive result.
I think it shows that it's hard to unseat somebody who's as popular as Turner, and although some of the polling suggested that he was getting low marks for things like infrastructure and streets and flooding, he's able to generate the kind of political enthusiasm that others weren't. And money can definitely get you a lot in certain kind of races, but in a race like this where people are less attentive, it still makes it hard to make a dent.
You know, for a long time, we saw you and we saw Mayor Turner side by side doing a lot of the things that were going on, and you developed a really good relationship with this mayor. You saw firsthand how hard this guy works. I mean, you all do when you work in this,
Sure.
but what Ashley was talking about is true. He's 7 days a week. He's really been working hard.
He is, and he's an engaging personality. And so if he's attacked on a corruption, you have to be very clear what that corruption is. And I thought the early ads by Tony Busby, they said City Hall is dirty, but he didn't say what. He didn't give specifics. And then, of course, the intern story came out, and that was kind of okay. That's one thing, but that's not an overwhelming issue that got the public's attention. If you're going to say somebody's corrupt, you better be able to say why. And when people have met somebody like Mayor Turner, they've seen him in crises, they go, well, okay, if that little thing over there is wrong, the bulk of his work has been good.
I think the judge is right. He's a fairly moderate mayor. He's appealed to the city's business community. He hasn't gone too far to the left, which could be problematic for him. He also solved the pension problem, which he more or less promised to do. He was able to ride out Harvey with some success, as much success as could be had. So there are some wins that he was able to put on the board that people remember, and that's the kind of thing that leads to re-election.
Well, Tony Busby would hope that you wouldn't remember any of that when it comes to this election going on here. Keith Garvin is at the headquarters where Tony Busby's watch party is taking place at the Crown Plaza. Keith, you got some activity down there. Looks like you got a little bit of activity behind you there.
Yeah, quite a bit of activity, Canberra. As a matter of fact, it's called a watch party, and by the sound of it, you can probably hear they are having a party here. We're at the Busby Watch Party headquarters, and I just got a text message on my watch from one of the staffers for Tony Busby, who just a few minutes ago said that he plans to arrive here at about 9:45, so that's not for another 90 minutes or so. But let me move out of the way so I can give you a look here at what has developed at this watch party here on the south side of Houston. You have a number of supporters, also, of course, members of the media as well. They are here. We know Tony Busby, the attorney and property developer, has been one of the more interesting candidates that we've seen in recent years. And you all have been talking about the fact that he spent his own money on his campaign, about $10 million, in fact, which is about 5 times as much as Sylvester Turner has spent on his. And I know you just mentioned a few moments ago that one of his mantras has been he wants to clean up the corruption in City Hall, but hasn't exactly pinpointed that. Has his message, though, been strong enough to resonate with voters? Right now, early exit polls are showing that the mayor has a significant lead, but Tony Busby's goal here was not necessarily to win the election tonight. His goal was to make sure he chipped away at the votes enough to be able to get the mayor into a runoff in December. That's his big hope. That's his big plan. That's what he wants to do. And at this point, if numbers hold, it does appear that he might have that runoff chance in December. Campaign staffer that I spoke to just a few moments ago here in person said that they all, quote, all of them are feeling really, really good. So they're feeling really good, really confident that they are going to be able to keep that mayor from keep him under 50% of the vote. And they are hoping that Tony Busby will have a shot at the runoff. And in that case, he plans to restate his case, maybe be even more emphatic. I heard the judge talking about Tony Busby not exactly pinpointing what any corruption of the mayor may be. He sounds like he plans to make sure he does that if he gets a shot at this runoff election in December. But yes, again, Tony Busby expected to arrive here in about another 90 minutes or so. Watch party. They're going to keep the party going at least until he gets here. And again, their hope is to at least come in second place and keep the mayor under 50%. Reporting live from the south side of Houston, near NRG, Keith Garvin, KPRC Channel 2 News. Camberell, back to you.
All right, thank you, Keith. A couple of things going on here. We understand that Bill King is getting ready to speak at a microphone someplace and at a watch party in Rice Military. Once he gets there, we'll go to him. So I know that his numbers are such that there's not a chance for him to make a runoff, and so we expect he'll be able to talk about that. But going into this, as Tony Busby and others have wanted to just make the runoff, the challenge has been to try to get that traction to make sure that they could do that. And going forward here, this whole process is really demonstrative of the fact that if you don't have money, then you don't really have much of a chance. And the question is, what comes first, the chicken or the egg, the money or the followers? You know, do you get the followers first? You get the. In this case, the money has led out to go ahead and get this lead so far. So Bill King right now at almost 13% of the early vote. So that indicates that there's really not much of a chance here. And you talked about the fact that Dwight Boykins was at 6%. And interesting to note that these poll numbers are pretty close to what they were early on. Mm-hmm. There are two polls that came out. One was the public radio one, and then also the Harris, the hobby. And they both had similar kind of numbers. Yeah. And I know that Dwight Boykins and Bill King both were saying, well, those numbers aren't quite right. But it looks like they are pretty close to being the correct ones.
They're about right. And one question is whether or not, if this holds, if Bill King supporters back Tony Busby. It's not quite the same. So
I understand Bill King is speaking right now. Let's go to the Cadillac Bar. I know our Sion Rhodes is standing by, but let's hear what Bill's saying.
Well, thank you all for coming. The first thing I want to say is that I am incredibly honored that tens of thousands of Houstonians went to the polls today and were prepared to entrust me with the mayoralty of this Houston. It's a great honor by any stretch of the imagination. The second thing I want to say is that looking around this room and looking at all the incredible friends and supporters, it just almost makes me want to cry, because I mean, you guys have been there. You were there in 2015. You were there again this year. And I can't tell you how honored I am to have the support of so many great people that are serious people about the future of this city. And I'm just very proud to have all of y'all, Mark, all the engineering helping you. This has just been an incredible campaign from the standpoint of the people that came together to try to make this work. You know, we live in a very discouraging political time. We live in a time when the hyper-partisan, loud, strident voices are prevailing in this country. And it looks like they may prevail in this election tonight, although there's still a lot of votes to be counted. And what I want to ask you to do is to not be discouraged. I'm not discouraged tonight, because the truth of the matter is we have no alternative but to continue to put up reasonable voices that want to talk about serious policy issues. Now, I'm afraid that we're headed to a runoff. We're going to hear a whole lot more about $95,000 a year interns and lift up every voice and a bunch of things we're fixing to do but haven't gotten around to doing for the last 4 years. What we will not hear is any discussion about how to solve the $435 million structural deficit that we're facing. What we will not hear is any discussion about how we actually solve the serious flooding problems that are flooding tens of thousands of people's homes a year. But look, we're going to have that discussion one day in this city. Whether I lead it or somebody else leads it, we're going to have that discussion. And all of you are the nucleus. You are the chosen few. They're going to make sure that we have this discussion. And I'm going to continue to have that discussion regardless of what the outcome is tonight. Yeah. And I encourage you not to give up on the city of Houston, even though we may not get the result we want tonight, because this is a great city. We've got great problems and great challenges, but we've got to face those head on. Yeah. And if it's not tonight, it's going to be sometime in the future. So again, I cannot tell you how incredibly grateful I am of the support that you've given me. 5,000 endorsements, 2,000 campaign contributors. We had none of the pay-to-play money. Of course, we were enormously outspent in this race, well over 10-1. But yet I think we proved that there are tens of thousands of Houstonians who care about a serious policy discussion about how we go forward with this city. And I'm so proud to have been part of that with all of you. So thank you so much.
Bill King, 8:15 comes out and basically concedes, which is a foregone conclusion looking at these early numbers from the early voting. Always a small group there, with him supporting him. You heard what he was saying. I mean, he's been a policy guy all the way through. He's always talked about solutions, his kind of way to make these kinds of, and because he came so close last time around, it's got to be heartbreaking for him to see the numbers the way they are tonight.
I think one of the big reasons he ran last time was to try to put the city's fiscal house in order, and to some degree that's happened. One thing he didn't do here was to tip his hand as to who he might support, because it could be the case that he might back Turner, but if it's the real question is whether he's going to back Busby or not. And if that happens, then you could have a real race in the runoff. That's
assuming people would go ahead and vote for the people who go for the guy, and a lot of times I'm not sure that
no, endorsements don't necessarily carry the weight that people think they do. But in the case of Bill King, I would hope that Bill stays involved, because he is a thinker and he does like to have solutions. And I think Brandon's right. When it was an open seat, people were worried about the finances of the city. Mr. King came off kind of as a policy wonk, which isn't all bad. Those of us who like to think we're a little wonkish. And so he's got a lot of ideas, and I hope that even if he decides electoral politics isn't the place he needs to be in the future, that people find a role. And frankly, I think the mayor would do well to find a role for Mr. King.
Yeah,
good idea.
Team of rivals,
yeah,
right?
That'd be a good thing. Hey, let's talk about the controller. That was something that is of interest. Orlando Sanchez, who at one point in time was the Harris County treasurer and has been a city council member for a number of years as well, and really came hard charging against Chris Brown. Those numbers show a pretty good separation there. Are you surprised at those numbers?
Well, no, I was going to go somewhere else with that, actually.
Okay.
He shows up pretty strong. He's at what, 46%?
45, yeah, close
45,
to
46. You compare that to what's going on in the mayor's race,
yeah,
where it was kind of overwhelming. You also have to remember that Orlando Sanchez came very close to being mayor.
Yeah.
Yes.
Before he was county treasurer. So, and the name is well known.
Yeah.
And frankly, just as an outsider watching, I didn't see Chris Brown doing that much.
I think one of those situations when you're an incumbent and he was just there, and I think there were some questions that came out later on about this land deal where he apparently got some money from a sale, and so maybe it was his best interest to stay quiet, but it's worked that way for him.
Orlando Sanchez filed on the very last day he could, so it was a late jump. So who knows what could have happened if he had really pushed. And I think the name ID was a big part of it. You still see those signs around town for last thing he ran for.
And he's used the same logo the whole time, and that's a smart thing to do, I might add.
Let's talk about City Council, because Houston City Council, that is. There are 108 people running for City Council, and we're going to go over each and every one of those candidates. No, I'm just kidding. We're not going to do that. But we are going to go down with some of the positions there, because they do have several people who decided not to run or were term limited, and we'll talk about some of those. At large, City Council at large 1. Incumbent is Mike KNOX there, and he definitely is back in the race again. Interesting here, though, not only just for Mike, but for Raj, the number 2 position there at 21%. And I was looking at some of the campaign finance information, and he had $250,000 in his
Raj
did. Right. And Mike Knotts had 40,000 or something like that. Obviously, the power of the incumbent. What is the deal? What is it about Raj Sohatra? I don't know how to pronounce the last name. Sohatra. Yeah. What is it about him that has been able to get this kind of traction? At least it's 21% is not as much as he would want to be, but it put so much money into this race. Yeah. Where did that come from?
I'll tell you this, my students love him. He has got an apparatus that allows them to be able to connect to people in their communities. So I think they've been very smart about organizing, and that's generated a lot of grassroots interest, which has generated a lot of money, not only from places here, but also around the country. So I think he's got that energy that when you talk to him, it makes it seem like he's somebody who's going to move to the next level.
Even though we say city elections are nonpartisan, if there is a partisan battleground, it's this city council district. I think Mr. Knox is perceived as Republican. All the others on that list are perceived as Democrats. And I think Raj gets in a runoff with Mike Knox. I think it will be very difficult for Councilmember Knox to come through.
Well, and Raj is the guy. He's a Rice guy, Harvard guy.
Must be smart.
Young guy. well,
and the U of A students like him.
So it's a win for everybody. Yeah. Well, he's young. He's from Rice and Harvard, and you said the apparatus is different. So that's and Mike Knotts on City Council got to be known for a guy who wasn't going to just go on as a rubber stamp for the mayor on various things. He was diametrically opposed to him in a lot of different ways too, which a lot of people appreciated. Who really said, you know, and he's come across as a guy who is a former city cop and went to law school and all that kind of stuff. So very interesting. We'll see what happens on the runoff.
Will be interesting.
All right, at large 2, David Robinson is the incumbent there, and he also had a big war chest running again, and it's 40 and 30% there. A number of people in that running for that particular position there. I'm not sure that there's much of a challenge going forward. I know 40 and 30 means that there is a chance for somebody there. When you have another high percentage of folk who are out there, anybody who's going to be running, they got to be concerned about that number. He would want to do better than that early on after the early voting.
I definitely think. I thought Dave Robinson was going to do better than that. So there's something else going on in that race that perhaps we didn't pick up on. It looks like if Willie Davis stays in second and that becomes the runoff, people will get to know Mr. Davis, which I think right now they may not.
Michael Kubash, at large 3, is the incumbent there, and you might expect that he wouldn't have a big problem with this, and the early numbers show that that is in fact the case. The interesting thing about this race is Marcel McClinton, who is the 18-year-old who decided to run for city council. So he started out early. Judge, how early were you? How young were you when you started running?
28.
28, so a little bit older.
But I will say, this is totally off the subject, but it's fun to remind people. In the 1972 elections for the legislature, that was 6 years before I ran, a whole bunch of people got elected that were 21, 22 years old. One guy named John Whitmire, still around, but there was Ron Waters and Don Henderson, and they were still students when they ran. But it was when they went to single-member districts. So young people running for office, if they can pick the right time and right place, it works.
This is one of those moments. I mean, this is certainly an opportunity for a lot of turnover in city council. No matter how we cut it tonight, you're going to have 8 new spots, and that means new people, new blood, new ideas, and that's going to make a different world for whoever's mayor. It'll
be interesting to see how that works. I know with council, Dwight Boykins often clashed with Mayor Turner because of style. He thought that the mayor's style was a little bit heavy-handed. I'll be curious to see how 8 new people come in and how they interact with the mayor in terms of that style going forward. At large 4, Amanda Edwards decided not to run. She is running for the Democratic nomination for Senate. And so we have City Council at large 4. And Anthony Dolcefino, this is one of those things where it may be as much name recognition as anything else. But Anthony comes from an area where he's running a very conservative area. I think a large amount of the votes, early votes, correct me if I'm wrong, Judge, but some of the early votes would have come from that area, would have helped him get to that 23% in the early running right now.
Right, and that's a strong showing in a race that big to have 23. So if it ends up being a runoff, my guess is it would be Anthony Dolcefino and Nick Hellier.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And that's who's running second now, but just based on endorsements and the campaign that we've seen run.
So your Dr. Plummer was there. So Hellier was the one who was nominated by, was endorsed by the Chronicle. And Letitia Plummer has run before, I believe. She's a dentist.
Right.
And I don't know too much about Erica McCutcheon, but so you're thinking that it would be a pretty good.
I think on election day, what I've seen out of the Hellier campaign is a lot of social media, a lot of emails, and those are the kind of things that do drive people out to vote. I haven't seen that from Letitia Plummer.
Okay.
We'll see how it turns out.
At large 5, Jack Christie, term limited, not going to be in that. And so you have a new group of people running for that. And Sally Alcorn is 24%, Eric Dick is 22%, Catherine Garcia Flowers 10%. What do we know about the top two in this race right now?
Sally Acorn ahead, really neck and neck with Eric Dick. And Eric Dick, a more or less known quantity, fairly conservative, and somebody who's probably going to ride some of the name ID, but Sally Acorn as well. So this could be a close one for how that shakes out. And it's interesting to again note that replacing Jack Christie here could very well be the determining factor on council. You could have that move in a fairly liberal direction in Houston City Council, which it hasn't been necessarily to date.
Yeah, Sally Alcorn seems to have gotten a lot of establishment type support from around the city. Eric Dick, of course, ran numerous times before he ever got elected to anything. And when he finally got elected, it was to the Harris County Department of Education, which nobody knows what it does particularly. And so he's just kind of slowly built up a name ID, and I think that's what you're seeing here, is that name ID. And he's running, it wasn't lost on me, he was running ads for his law firm right up to the last part of the campaign. Not as campaign ads, but as the Dick Law Firm.
Okay, well, in this case, hey, if it works, it works. All right, District A, Brenda Stardig is term limited. So Amy Peck, who is actually her chief of staff, looked like the person who's going to be the heir apparent there, and it looks like in the early running that seems to be happening.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I think Amy has been out front from the beginning. Frankly, I'd be surprised if she didn't make it without a runoff, but based on these numbers, it looks like she may be forced into a runoff.
District B, Jerry Davis, term limited as well, and there's 14 candidates running in this area. So, man, there are just a lot of people there trying to get involved, and Tarsha Jackson was endorsed by the Chronicle in that. She was actually the Texas Organizing Project head here, so very active in terms of politics, Acres Homes. Renee Jefferson Smith got the nomination, not the nomination, but the endorsement of the Communication Workers of America, which they seem to believe in their endorsements making a big difference, although the last couple of people they endorsed for that position didn't win. But nonetheless, those two are really close between Cynthia Bailey and Renee Jefferson Smith. Again, all of these numbers are early voting numbers. We talked about the fact that numbers are going to be coming in a little bit later. And Judge, we were talking earlier about, and Brandon, you as well, about the way this has all changed in terms of how these numbers come in. Once upon a time, you know, the polls close at 7. You start to see some numbers trickling in, maybe precinct by precinct. Now that's changed. Why has it changed the way it has?
Well, let me go back, and then Brandon can probably correct what I'm going to say. If you go back far enough, the campaigns knew who won immediately, because they literally had the voting machines. They would open the back of them, and it would show you the totals. So you'd have a campaign worker at each poll. They'd call you, and you'd add them up, and by 8 o'clock or 8:30, you'd say whether you won or lost. The official polls votes go downtown, and they're all counted. Well, now that we have this voting where anybody can vote anywhere, then you can't settle some of these races until they're all in. And I think that it's going to delay the result. It makes it easier for people to vote, but it could delay the result.
Yeah. And we saw some hiccups today with the transition, which is totally normal. In fact, looking at the data across the states, the counties that have switched to vote center models have had these kinds of problems. It just takes a couple of cycles to iron out the wrinkles, which is why the ledge encouraged them to do it in off-cycle elections, so it wasn't.
I'm a big believer in voting centers. But if you have voting centers and then you keep all the individual precincts, you miss the point. Yeah. The idea of the voting centers is so people can vote anytime at these big regional centers, and you don't have to open up the little neighborhood voting places, because those take a long time to get in.
Does that change the way you as politicians and political scientists analyze things, though? Do you have to change the whole way that you do things when you go away from the precinct type of setup? Because once upon a time, couldn't you tell when you start to see the numbers come in from a certain precinct,
Sure.
you know what those numbers are. When you have this style of voting, you don't have a chance to do that.
Right. Yeah, we used to do it all the time. You'd say, well, what part of town has come in? Well, now, if you can vote where you work, not where you live, it changes everything. And it makes it easier to vote, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
Some of the things we look at show that driving distance matters, so if you can make it more convenient, people will show up to vote, so that's one thing. The problem, though, is there could be a line effect, where if there's a bigger line, it could necessarily unduly burden people's right to vote, which is problematic for lots of reasons. So there's an issue there potentially in 2020 when turnout's going to be big.
Yeah, and let's be clear. Prior to going to the big regional centers on election day, or leaving them open on election day, you could look at the precincts in one of these council districts, and once they're in, they're in.
Right.
They're not now, because you could have votes for that council district cast anywhere else in the city.
Yeah.
And so you have to wait till they're all in to know for sure.
So late nights for everybody then, pretty much, for those areas.
For those that are close.
Actually, for a lot of people, because it's everywhere. Okay. Let's continue. District C, Ellen Cohen, term limited. She's not going to be back in that position again. And I wonder if she's going to continue, because she's been a real strong public servant. It'd be great to see her continue on there. Abby Kamen, 32%. She has been endorsed. She had a lot of money in her war chest as well, a couple $100,000 there. Is that another one of those examples where you talk about, even though it's not a partisan contest, maybe it is underneath or not?
A little bit, because that council district, it's marginal. I'd say it's generally Democratic, but Mary Jane Smith, of course, has been Republican activist for many, many years. Greg Myers was on the school board for a while, and he's a Republican. And so you start adding up their votes, and you start getting up to the 30%. Can one of them get in the runoff with Abby? Maybe.
Yeah, only a few hundred votes separate somebody like Shelley Kennedy from, Greg Myers, so it's going to be kind of a jump ball here. But Kamen's run a really good campaign. I think she's been very active and has been kind of waiting in the wings for a while for this, so they've been prepared, and I think you see that show up here in the numbers. District
D is another one of those districts vacated by Dwight Boykins, who decided to run for mayor. And once he said, I'm not going to run, a lot of people jumped in. There's 15 people running for this position. Carolyn Evans Shabazz at 20% now leading the way. Carla Braley, who is a professor over Texas Southern. Brad Scarface Jordan, one of the ghetto boys. Rashad Cave, who was the Chronicle endorsed candidate here. Carolyn Evans Shabazz, I'm not really surprised at that number, although clearly we'll have to see what happens on the day of. I mean, Carolyn Ms. Shabazz is the chair of the board of Houston Community College, so her name has been known because of that, and so perhaps that's a big advantage, or helps her along the way anyway in this city council race up to this point. What do you think, Judge?
Well, you also have to look at it. I believe Mr. Burks, Andrew Burks Jr., was on city council, wasn't he?
Yes.
Not that long ago.
Right.
And he's running fifth, sixth.
Right.
So you have this many people. Evans Shabazz clearly has a name advantage, but it's going to be a runoff. And the interesting thing about races like this, the people who support candidates just walked away from this. Yeah. They said, we'll wait and see which two get in the runoff, and then we'll engage.
Good point. Good point. Good point. All right, let's go to the next race, which is District E. And there are only a couple of people running. And Dave Martin is the incumbent, Sam Cleveland, and that's not going to be a problem. Dave is going to be reelected to City Council District E. F, this is an interesting district here. Mm-hmm. Steve Lee not running, decided he wasn't going to run. There was a lot of stuff going around Councilmember Lee surrounding accusations of double dipping on pay and some other kinds of things. So he decided not to.
And he didn't live here.
Oh,
that was out there too.
Didn't live here. That's probably something you got to do.
Well,
council representative.
No, don't get us off. This residency requirement is an interesting thing. People get around it.
Yeah.
a lot,
Yeah.
but that was always one of the allegations. So
And some of the people, some of the advocates in there, some of the people who are in that district were saying when he decided not to run, they said that was the best political decision he'd made since he'd been there. Not making light of your service, Mr. Lee, but it is what it is. Now let's look at the people who are there now, where they stand in terms of the numbers at this point. Tiffany Thomas at 39%, Van Huen at 26%, Richard Nguyen at 18%, and Van was the chief of staff for Councilmember Lee. So there he is at number 2 at this point. And Tiffany Thomas was a candidate who, she was endorsed by the Chronicle and got a lot of play as somebody who's been active and doing what she could. That whole district, though, there's a lot of churn there. That whole thing has been, there's a lot of turnover there. Richard Nguyen was a former city council member, and so he's running 3rd at this point. Each election cycle there's somebody new, and so at some point they got to have some consistency in that district. It would seem.
Yeah, and we're not going to get it because we're going to have a runoff, no doubt, for this. But I figure Thomas and Nguyen would be the two that would be here, and I think we're going to probably see that, even though it's a little early.
this district's particularly interesting because we always love to brag about the diversity of the city of Houston and the changing demographics.
Right.
Well, the demographics that are changing in this district, a lot of us just can't relate to it all. We go, really? And so the way this local politics plays out is going to be fascinating to watch.
It is. Over the years, I've been here 20 years, and I've seen that district is kind of, it's always been kind of an Asian candidate kind of district. But Tiffany Thomas doesn't sound like an Asian name.
No, but before that, this is all the area that used to be, the state representative was Talmadge Heflin, a very conservative
forever.
Republican.
Yes.
And so once it started switching.
I remember when he was in.
And so now it may be switching in a different way, which is fascinating.
All right, District G is incumbent Greg Travis, and he is not going to have a problem moving on, continuing to serve the folk in that district. District H is Carla Cisneros' district. She is the incumbent there and is at this point probably not doing as well as she would hope to do. I don't know. I think I saw that not a lot of money raised by her in this process, but I think as an incumbent, she probably didn't think that she needed to. Right. But in this case, there's going to be a runoff here, and it looks like it's going to be close to see who's going to be running against her in this regard. Some well-known names there, though, so that's probably one of the things that helps.
Of course, this will be a good one to point out. Number of registered voters in that district, 82,000. 6,000 have voted. I mean,
Pretty low.
yeah.
And the one question for me too is this: whether the progressive energy in that district is enough to push Longoria into a runoff, and then maybe even to win. So that will be one to watch.
What's it going to take to get people to get the vote? I mean, in City of Houston, on the surface, you would say, wow, with that mayor's race as hot as it is, we really need to come out. I know you made a point about 12 people in. A lot of people say, well, let me just wait for the top 2 and I'll go in and vote then. But when you talk about that small number, consider the percentage of voters who came out and actually voted. And we talk all the time about make sure you vote, make sure you vote. The apathy is just palpable.
The turnout is driven by the mayor's race. There's no question about that. And in a case where it is so negative,
Okay.
a lot of people just say, we're not inspired.
I had a conversation with someone who's working on the mayor's staff, and I think at some point after the Busby spot started to run, and they were fairly negative pretty early, and they said, we can only get slapped in the face so many times without responding. Right. And so then it gets to a point where one goes negative, at some point they feel like they got to go. And so I think that's probably why we went that way.
And the mayor's race wasn't a referendum on one overriding issue, like flood control or transportation sometimes in the past, or crime in the past has been a big issue. This time there wasn't that galvanizing issue that got everybody to go out and vote.
All right, let's talk about District I, incumbent Robert Gallegos in that district, and he is not going to have a problem against Richard Gonzalez. So Gallegos is moving on. District J is incumbent Mike Laster. He is not running, term limited. And so the challenge in that district was to see who's going to make the runoff. And Edward Pollard is leading in that right now. Sandra Rodriguez had a lot of support early on. She got the endorsement by the Chronicle. As we know, that sometimes that doesn't matter. She is from the Gulfton area, from that area all of her life, and so knows the area really well. But looks like that's going to be an interesting runoff going forward, depending on what happens with the day of vote that comes in. As I said, a reminder to all of you who are online watching here now, these numbers reflect the early voting numbers and not the current day of voting at this point. So we'll continue to go with what we have. We know we're going to have a slow evolution of the day of vote. So that's just the way it is. District K, incumbent Martha Castex Tatum. And don't expect her to have to do anything in terms of a runoff. Of course, she is took over. She was working with Council Member Larry Green before he passed, and so she was considered the heir apparent, if you will. And so she's done that and is doing that going forward. A couple of other things going on here. We've got some propositions that we want to talk to. Daniel, if we can pull up that, let's go through some of the propositions here before we go to HISD, because HISD is very interesting as well. Propositions, though, there are 10 of them, and all of us had a chance to vote on these. So the process of what they are, Proposition 1 had to do with the municipal judges being able to hold multiple offices. Some people wanted to vote against that because they said, well, I don't care what, they wanted to give people in the smaller areas a chance to say, well, sometimes you have to have, in order to have a judge to be over an area, then maybe they could be in both places in some areas. Yeah. And the people who are voting against it said, no. If you're going to be a municipal judge here, you got to be elected by the group, no matter what that situation is. Your thoughts, Judge?
Well, this one was very interesting to me because I had to read it and go, now, wait a minute, what is this about? I think people just don't react well to having people elected and serve another office at the same time. The simple solution, I think, these municipalities that have trouble finding people, change it to an appointed municipal judge, and you solve your problem. I just think voters went, wait a minute, if you're elected to one thing, why should you have another office too? Just double dipping is never something that people look on favorably.
Right.
And voters have historically been reluctant to change the structure of elections or the institutions, so it's not surprising. It's not going to be overwhelmingly passed, but it does look like it'll pass.
Yeah. Okay, Prop 2, Water Board.
Wait.
What?
That one, you think it is going to pass?
Is it close?
It's against. The
it's
numbers
against.
against were.
No, it's almost 2 to 1 against.
Yeah, 65. Yeah.
That would.
There it is, 65% against.
Now, that's in Harris County.
Right. Yeah.
And so you get in the smaller rural areas, they're the ones who may need this. So it could tighten up considerably.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you're in a smaller area,
But-
you're depending on that.
But they also don't have many reasons to go vote because they don't have a mayor's race.
Yeah, right.
Good point. Apathy takes over again.
And
All
that
right.
would be consistent, if they voted against it.
Prop 2, Water Board bonds. They're 65% for that, 35% against. As you said, it's Harris County numbers, so we don't know what it's going to look like the rest of the way, but that's a trend. I think that a lot of people are understanding of that process and what that proposition means.
This one touches home with me a great deal because a place like Harris County, we can have a bond election, we can take care of our own needs. 86% came out and approved the flood control bonds. But if you're out in an area, as they say, an economically distressed area, what are you going to do? The state's got to step in, and this creates that.
Right.
It helps.
Prop 3 deals with property tax relief for distressed areas, and so a lot of people say, look, that makes total sense that they ought to have that right to do that. 86% for. I don't think there's going to be much of a change in that trend going forward for the rest of the
Prop
state.
3 and Prop 4, anything you put on the ballot that says I'm going to reduce or eliminate a tax, people in Texas are going to vote for it.
Yeah.
Now, the problem is, sooner or later, you've eliminated all the taxes, and then what are you going to do?
Good point.
But yeah, these, once they get put on the ballot, they're going to pass.
All right, Prop 4 is similar, talking about, okay, we don't want to, no individual income tax. So the problem with that is that there's already stuff in the law that takes care of that, isn't it? I mean, since 1993, there's an amendment that requires voter approval in order to establish a tax. So this is just like we're just wasting paper, wasting our time. I mean, what's the point?
This just makes it even harder.
I'm playing devil's advocate.
Yeah, no, it just makes it even harder because now you got to go back and amend the Constitution again.
Right, right.
And that's the real trick, is that the way it's written in statute, as I understand it, is that if it was the case that there was an income tax it would have to be distributed a certain way. Now it doesn't have to be because it's not constitutional. So
Right.
it's a way to kind of overcome the statutory provisions that might allow that to happen. But it's also a way down the road for Republicans to be able to have some significant legal traction on the question about whether there's a legit reason for an income tax and or a franchise tax, the business tax. So it's an obvious yes, I think, like Judge said, for most Texans, but there's some complicating factors here that could create some havoc down the road with raising revenue for the state.
And you've been concerned, you as a county judge, you had to deal with the state wanting to do a number of things that may not have been in the best interest of Harris County when you were there. One of the things it would seem to me would be, okay, once you start eliminating all the sources of income, what do? I mean, that becomes a challenge.
Yeah, anytime you eliminate revenue source for a local government, you got a problem. Now, that Prop 4 doesn't apply to that.
Right,
That
right.
doesn't have anything to do with it. But the property tax measures do. And, you know, there used to be this theory that the best government was the government closest to the people, the local. But, you know, folks in Austin have kind of said, no, we're going to make some of those decisions for you now. And it could be a problem down the road.
Yeah, I remember a couple of exchanges that were going on between Austin and Harris County at some point in time by the judge who was there at that time about that sort of thing. But I digress. Proposition 5, sports-related sales tax to parks and wildlife. I saw this earlier and said, well, that's a no-brainer. You don't have to pay any extra tax. You just figure out how the tax is going to be applied.
Yeah,
You think,
let me be devil's advocate.
I was
It was
counting
clear
on
this was going to pass.
yeah,
But the more you start taking revenue and saying it's got to go here or it's got to go there, then the general fund begins to go away, and the legislators are going to have trouble. Now, this isn't a big enough deal to matter, but if that trend continues, that where the sales tax from this goes to a particular item in the budget, it makes it harder for the budget writers in the Capitol to take care of the needs of the state.
and I'm leery about what goes on behind closed doors anyway to try to split stuff up. It seems to me, I remember when the lottery was first formulated and supposed to go to education and across the board, a lot of different things, and somehow or another, yeah, maybe not in the way that we anticipated.
Well, I'll give you another example. The gasoline tax. 1 cent of that has to go to farm to market roads.
Yeah.
Well, does that make sense today?
Yeah.
Probably not.
Yeah.
And it's also the case, I think, that the ledge is looking for a way to be able to cover this. They didn't do it legislatively, so they're asking voters to approve it.
Right.
And I don't like that. I think that they could do the job. That's part of what we send them there for.
Good point.
Just briefly.
Okay, Prop 6, increase the borrowing for cancer research. And that sounds like that makes sense, doesn't it? Of course, they had some real challenges here not long ago when there were some problems with mismanagement that they have supposedly corrected. I think voters took that into account. Right now, Texas does spend a lot of money toward cancer research. So it looks like that's not going to change, according to what we're seeing here from Harris County. Prop 7, increased distributions from the general fund to the school fund. And so that's people see education, money available for education. They're kind of loath to go against that based upon face value of what they say it's going to do. So 74%, 26%. A lot of people obviously are in favor of making that happen. Prop 8, creating flood infrastructure. This would be something that a lot of people, especially here, we don't know what the rest of the state, how they're going to come up with this, but hopefully they're sympathetic to what goes on here and other places along the borders. You never know, but
Well, and this is a statewide plan, so much of flood control has to be done across county lines. I mean, water doesn't recognize those lines all the time. And so if you're going to have a big flood control project that's across county lines, the state needs to do it. So that's what this allows. It's interesting to see in recent years, we have a Texas Water Development Board. It was created to provide water, and now it's been given the task of keeping water away, which is a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
They didn't change the name of the board,
Right.
which frankly I think they should have, but they didn't. But as long as the state says, okay, flood control is a problem we need to address, it's a good thing.
And that's a good help for counties like ours, which individually have taken control of it, our own destiny, if you will. I'm in Fort Bend, not Harris County, but you get my picture. We're all in the same area. Everybody, I know in Fort Bend, they're voting now on as well on various things that have to do with flood control and that sort of thing. Right. Everybody antenna is up about that, so that's a good thing.
They're taking money from the rainy day fund too, so that might be a harbinger of things to come in the future. Right. If there are things that are one-time kind of projects that they want to use it for, perhaps the voters are the ones to okay it, because so far the ledge isn't really willing to do that.
Right.
That's true.
Proposition 9, tax exemptions for precious metals. And if you look at that and you say, huh? What is that all about? Well, you know, it's a unique scenario. The attempt is to put us on par with what's going on around the country.
I'm glad you said us. People like you who have these vast gold deposits that they have to keep somewhere. This allows you to keep them in the state of Texas without paying, property tax on them.
Yeah, it's a good thing.
I don't have those worries.
Yeah, that's not a word. That's a word that I wish I had, quite frankly. All right, in Proposition 10, I call this transfer of FIDO proposition because it just makes a whole lot of sense. If you have a law enforcement officer and they have a pet, or not a pet, but they have a working dog, I mean, people look at that and they say, come on, really? Come on, let the dog go to the home where the trainer has been all his life, and let's not.
I only have one question.
What's that?
Who are the curmudgeons that voted against this? I mean, really?
I know. Who are you 6%ers? Come on.
6%, that's an interesting number. Again, I'll get us off the subject. Took a poll back in 2018, just random, asking people what they think of various officials. So we threw Jose Altuve's name on it. 6% of the people in Harris County didn't like Jose Altuve. I'm going, well, that means you cannot possibly please everybody.
That's true. Good point.
So it's probably the same 6% that are voting no here.
Or it's a protest vote because it's a complicated, and people don't know why we're doing this. I had to explain to my 13-year-old that we're voting on this as Texans, that this is okay, what obviously would be like a no-brainer in any situation. Yeah. So I think a lot of people out there are just voting no because they don't like the process.
We got Metro. Metro's got a proposition on there right now. A lot of transportation issues. Plan to raise $3.5 billion in bonds. And they made a point as they were promoting this that it would not require tax. So voters, they knew what to say to voters to try to get them to say, okay, if it's not going to cost me anything, then I can do that. But there are a lot of people. I heard Gilbert Garcia, the former chair of the Metro board, who was adamantly against this from the principle of not of determining, well, they don't really have it planned out on how they're going to finance this. That was his take. But 68% of the folk are saying that it's a good idea.
Well, it doesn't require tax. They've already got their tax. This just allows them to front load these projects. So the real debate was over, do you approve of the plan?
Right.
Do you like the projects they have in the plan? What was interesting about it to me is over the years, the conservatives have been against the rail in large measure.
True.
They said, we need bus rapid transit. We need to use buses. They're more flexible. Metro said, okay, a whole lot of this is going into bus rapid transit. They're doing some rail lines to the airport, which most people think that's an okay thing. So I think they put together a plan that, Mr. Garcia notwithstanding, most people went, yeah, we're okay.
Yeah.
Anytime you start talking about a bond, some folks are going to vote against it. They don't like debt.
Period.
But in this case, I think Metro did a really good job of selling it.
We have been talking about in the news recently a lot around HISD. We know that the state is now prepared to take over that Board of Trustees because of a number of different reasons, and the voters have chimed in today, and up to now, at least the early voting, they have pretty much said, okay, you know, everybody who's been involved with this, who's been here before, you're not going to be here going forward. Now, this does not apply to position 2, which you see right now, because Rhonda Skillen-Jones, who was in that position, is now running for Houston Community College trustee seat. So all of these folk are new to the process there. So we see those numbers. Can you put those back up again for me? We noticed that Kathy Bluford Daniels has got 46% of the vote. So she's been working pretty hard there. John Curtis Gibbs, 21%. Chris Moses, who was the Chronicle nominee or endorsement, is only 14% at this point in time. But the point is that voters have said, okay, we're definitely going, this is somebody we want to get in there. 46%, we want to go with you. Position 3, this is incumbent Sergio Lira. And voters have pretty much said to him, no, you're done. Danny Hernandez. This is the early voting now. We never know. Day of voting, we could be different, but when you have this kind of margin, it's doubtful. But he has been one of the people who was identified or talked about, mentioned in some of the reports that the state put out on some of the reasons why they were going to take over the board because of meetings that were taking place that shouldn't have been taking place. A number of different things were in the process, which required them to the state to say, we're going to move over and take you over. Position 4, Jolanda Jones is not running for re-election. And so in this case, we looked at Patricia K. Allen at 32%, Reagan Flowers at 29%, Matt Barnes at 27%. And we were talking about this earlier. You know, Patricia K. Allen is not a name that had a lot of advertisement out overtly. Reagan Flowers has been very active in her STEM programs throughout the area. Matt Barnes was endorsed by the Chronicle, has been active in a lot of different ways as well. Very close there. The battle is going to be for who's going to be in that runoff. Patricia Allen, by the way, for those who may not know, is a retired educator, 35 years or so with HISD. So a lot of people within HISD know her name. And so if you're not within HISD, you may not know. So it was a surprising name when we saw that coming up.
Yeah, I think that race is still wide open as to which 2 of those 3 make it into the runoff.
Yes.
And so that becomes an election day battle. Because for all intents and purposes, that's an even race right
Sure.
now.
Yeah, because the day of voting, you don't know what's going to happen. So, and everybody's going to be in for a late night tonight because of what we talked about, the ballots coming in late. Okay, position 8. Incumbent is Diana Davila, the chair of the board, and Judith Cruz is going to be taking that position. And that's another example of Diana Davila has been very prominently at the head of all of this and fought back, pushed back, but the state has said, no, you're like one of the main reasons we're doing this. Quite frankly, I mean, the reading as the key catchphrase these days seems to be read the transcript. You can read that report, and it pretty much says all of those things. Right. It really does. It just talks about a dysfunctionality of that trustee area, and a couple of the trustees moved on. So Phil Archer is at the Mayor Turner's watch party at the George R. Brown Convention Center. We talked about that earlier, and of course the early numbers indicated almost 49% for the mayor from the early voting totals once again. So now we go to the Mayor Turner's watch party. Well, Phil Archer has been there, and I know there really wasn't much going on when we were there earlier. Phil, has the mood changed since you were there last time?
Oh, yeah, what a difference an hour makes. The mood in this room, as the crowd grows here, has gone from subdued to festive. There's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is the arrival of the candidate. Mayor Turner arrived here just about 8:30, came here and said he was very, very upbeat about the early vote returns. Those returns you were talking about, the result gives the mayor over 48% of the early vote. His closest competition, Tony Busby, trailing with about 29%. Mayor Turner says he's very optimistic. He says he thinks some voters were turned off by the attacks directed at him by Busby, whose style the mayor likened during the campaign to President Trump.
I think the numbers speak for themselves. People are exhausted. of people just throwing out something from somebody's playbook on a national scene. People don't want to see this national nastiness take place in the city of Houston. We're better than that. You know, we are a city that's the most diverse city. People want to see us working together.
The mayor also saying that he is hoping to win tonight without a runoff, but he's not predicting that. So very big mood swing here at the Turner Watch Party. Everyone expecting the best now, hoping to see those numbers, the margin, I should say, in those numbers between the candidates to grow in their candidates' favor. Reporting live at the George Brown Convention Center, I'm Phil Archer, KPRC Channel 2 News.
All right, thank you very much, Phil. There are a couple of races going on, the state house districts that are up as well. District 148 is the state house district in Harris County that people were looking at voting for. And there were 15 people running in this race. 15 jumped into this. And it's a very close now for number one and number two. You see Adrian Garcia, by the way. That is not Harris County's Adrian Garcia, former sheriff. That's a different Adrian Garcia. I saw that, I think, one of the last elections he ran for something.
Well, but name ID, you know, former city council member, former sheriff, defeated candidate for mayor, defeated candidate for Congress, and now county commissioner. Yeah, he's been on the ballot for lots of things.
Right. And so now he's in for that too.
So if your name happens to be Adrian Garcia, you've gotten a lot of name ID over the years.
Okay. What do we know about Anna Eastman? I know that she was former HISD. And the district that she represented in HISD happens to also be in District 148.
Always helps, yeah. And her fundraising was good, so that's definitely a race that she could do well in, but it's close. I also think that it's interesting that you've got a Republican here, Louis Larada, who is taking a pretty good chunk out of this. This is not a district a Republican could win in a traditional race, but if you've got a low turnout, it could be anybody's game.
When you talked about that earlier, when you're low turnout changes a lot, and this is also one of those races where Jessica Farrar that was her district.
Right.
I mean, there's no way you could pry her out of there no matter what. But once she is out, now it just leaves an opportunity for Republicans to maybe say that's a chance for us. Is that some of what's going on here?
Yeah, absolutely. But this district is overwhelmingly Democrat. So I think even in the special election runoff, it'll stay Democrat. But years ago, when the Republicans were in the distinct minority, you could pick districts and say, okay, we're going to run in that special election. And there were a number in Harris County that elected Republicans, and they never served in a legislative session because when the general election came along, they lost. We may be seeing the same thing down in Fort Bend the other way, where a Democrat's making a big push for House District 28 in Fort Bend County. And I think even if she gets there, then she doesn't win in the general. And I think he's going to tell us.
Well, we can talk about District 28 while we can see some numbers, but talk about what's going on there.
Yeah, so this is a district that John Zerwas is leaving. He's retiring, and he is leaving it to Elizabeth Markowitz, who's the Democrat, and a couple of other Republicans, Tricia Kranick and Gary Gates, all of whom are struggling to try to get to the runoff. Gary Gates is self-funded and so and has poured a lot of money into it, but Tricia Kranick has got a lot of local support, so this is going to be tight, but it's looking, given the numbers are here early, that Gary Gates is going to be in the runoff.
Yeah, it's probably too early to tell. It would be interesting to see if Mr. Gates gets in the runoff, if the other Republicans rally around him, because they have a primary coming up in March. The Republicans will all be running against each other in the primary in March. Yeah. So it's going to be odd, but they may say, you know what, we really don't want to help you win this special. So, because they'll keep going against him. What is interesting about this, Ms. Markowitz had national campaign come in for her. You know, Beto O'Rourke came in campaign for her. She raised money around the country. If this is the best they can do in a special election with a low turnout, it's not going to look good for them.
I saw probably some of the nastiest ads against Ms. Markowitz, it was just unbelievable, the kind of things that were being said. I thought that tone was amazing, and it's unfortunate, but it's all part of what goes on in our politics these days. Let's talk about HCC. There's a couple of things going on there with HCC. Dave Wilson, you might remember Dave. Mr. Wilson ran in the District 2 a number of years ago, and he did so. It was very clever. He did so. He didn't put his picture associated with anything, and the people who had been representing District 2 had been African American, and Dave was running, and there was somebody else whose name was Wilson, who was the state rep at one time, and so he just ran on just the name. And he won, and he's been a very vocal guy and has been censured by the board and a whole bunch of other things. Well, he moved. He changed district to run in District 1, and Monica Flores Rickert is winning that right now, and it looks like there's a chance that she could win it outright without having to do a runoff, because as we said, this is early voting. This is not day of voting at all. So these numbers at 47%, depending on what happens on the day of, it could very easily be something where she could win 50% of vote and move on and not have to worry about that going forward. District 2 is the district where Rhonda Skillern-Jones is running. She's former HISD, moved on from that position, and now is running in District 2 and has a pretty good lead at that point. Another one of those name recognition kind of things. Her name has been around for a bit. Some would say not necessarily for the better, but based upon what's happening in HISD.
Well, I have to say, though, she came out of HISD relatively unscathed compared to some of the others. And if you look back, Anna Eastman was before the latest problems at HISD. But in a way, it kind of benefits you if you were there and you weren't the problem.
Right.
They say, well, when you were there, it was okay.
Right.
And I think Rhonda Skillern-Jones, even though it lapped over onto her a little bit, they remembered she'd been there for a few years.
She had been there for a few years. She had been board chair for a bit as well, and was not painted with the brush of scandal.
Right.
Just happened to be on the board. And the dysfunctionality. Everybody was painted with dysfunctionality. So anyway, we can take a look at some of the other mayoral races across the area as well, and know that many of you are interested in some of those races. Bel Air mayor, for example. And Mayor, Judge, you know some of these folks?
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
I know Andrew particularly very well, and it looks like he's going to just breeze through.
That just did not, when you see numbers in the hundreds, of course, that's the early voting numbers, but still, it's just not very many people out there voting.
It's not, but the percentage tells a lot.
Yep. Western Lakes Mayor Ramona Neal, Mary Rose. Ramona Neal, 54% right now. Of course, it's very early, too early to tell at this point before the day of votes come in. Patton Village Mayor Nathan Hudek, Scott Anderson, the top two vote getters. Scott Anderson looks like he's on his way with a 44 votes. Early voting.
I love these. And my students ask all the time, like, why do we vote? What's the point? And this is a perfect example.
It
You
is.
literally could swing an election.
Yeah. When you talk about, say 62 votes,
Right.
60%, 60% to 40% in the Splendora mayor's race. And so all of these are very early on. This is going to be, with the new way that we're voting, it's going to be the new norm, I think. What can be done to change that for the better, do you think? The way it's set up now, is there a way to get it done so that we can get voting totals in that are meaningful before 3 hours after the polls close? We'll come up on the 10 o'clock newscast and we still won't have much in the way of any kind of the day of voting, which is not helpful.
Well, I think they still have the circumstance where the election judge has to drive the results down.
Yes, that's true.
And we live in an electronic world. You would think that you could send them electronically and get the results almost instantaneously at that point. And then if somebody needed to go back and check, I will say that the legislature last session started looking really hard at the idea of we don't have a paper trail anymore. Yeah. And how do you go back and check if the election was legit? And that I think more and more people, particularly the more electronic it gets,
Sure.
they're going to start, and with the hacking, the Russian hacking and
Right.
bots and all that, people are going to start going, wait a minute, maybe we ought to look at the way we do it. And of course, our machine, I have to gripe as one who endured it. This machine, you have to twist back and forth.
Right, and push
You
the
get
number.
carpal tunnel by the time you finish the general election ballot.
Especially all the judges. Yeah, you're down the ballot.
Yeah, I'm well aware of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Saw that firsthand.
Firsthand, right?
Well, the problem is that when you have a big county like Houston and you have all those judges, that becomes a problem. The reality is, I think you'll be the first one to agree with me that this straight ticket voting is something that we're glad that we don't have around anymore.
Yeah, I wish we hadn't had it around a little earlier.
I'm sure.
But no, it's a straight ticket. But you understand why people did it, because the Harris County ballot in 2018 was the longest ballot in the United States, and we had to do all the twisting. So you can't blame people for going in there saying, "Ah, to heck with this. I'm just going to vote and get out of here."
Right.
What's interesting is that Texas is not the only state that's moving away. There are more than 8 or 9 states in the last decade that have moved away from straight ticket voting, because there is a concern that people are kind of blindly voting partisan down the ballot, which may not reflect actual opinions, and a lot of legislatures got fed up with it. So Texas is more or less at the kind of vanguard on this in some ways.
Well, there are only about 7 or 8 states that still allow straight ticket voting.
But
But of course that doesn't apply to any of this.
and then on the one hand, you want to get people to come vote, and on the other hand, you want to make it really difficult for them to vote.
Yeah.
You know, come and vote. It's your civic duty, and you get there and you have to go the carpal tunnel thing as opposed to doing straight tickets. So it's something we should do.
And
So-
Texas still got 20th century infrastructure for a lot of voting, and people complain that we can't do stuff online and we can't get registered automatically. And there are other states and counties across the country that can do this in ways that are so much easier than we do it.
And I don't know that with all the hacking that we know is going on in some places now, I don't know to what extent this hacking is happening here. I don't think anybody knows, but I think because of that may be why some places are also going to the paper ballots again.
Right.
Because they don't want to have to rely on electronic numbers when somebody goes to vote and the numbers and the vote thing shows up and it's not somebody they voted for. And it's a whole different ballgame.
Well, I saw the interview with one of the voters today who showed up at the poll, gave her Texas ID. It was
Right.
on Channel 2.
Right.
And they gave her a ballot that didn't apply to her at all. And she said, wait a minute, this isn't the right ballot. So just a few stories like that, even if they're so rare, they challenge the integrity of the system, and that's not good.
We have been living in this environment where we are in silos and we are so partisan. I'm changing the subject on you right now, but I'm thinking about this election that we're dealing with as far as the mayor's concerned and how nasty it was. And the mayor talked about how the nastiness of this may have turned off people in some ways. The challenge going forward is what? As we try to evolve. Because as long as we have partisan sniping on the Washington level and there's success on the Washington level by certain candidates, then they're going to be imitators on the lower levels to try to do the same thing. So how do we ever get out of this nastiness where we don't, you are one of these kind of people, you're a Republican, but you are a Republican who could talk both sides of the aisle and bring people together, that sort of thing, which wasn't happening on the national level. You remember we talked about There was a time when, you would be really good friends with people. You could have a conversation with somebody. I can disagree with you, but I don't have to call you a dog.
Right.
Yeah.
How do we change that dynamic?
Well, part of that, Mayor Turner and I have talked about this a lot. He likes to say we were both house trained, which is a little sketchy. But we both were members of the Texas House. And it was at a time where he was in the minority. I was in the minority when I was there. In fact, there were 24 Republicans and 126 Democrats when I went to the Texas House. I ended up a committee chair under a Democratic speaker. The folks at the national level have no comprehension of doing that. Sylvester Turner was a leader in the legislature, even though it was dominated by Republicans. You had to get along with people.
Right.
And most issues just aren't partisan. And that's why I'm particularly sad to see city elections go partisan, because streets and flooding and things like that, those are not partisan issues.
Right. Right. We have been talking about the numbers that we've been looking at for you this evening, and they are early numbers. We don't have numbers from today's voting. I'm told by my producer, Young Daniel, I like to call him. He's not all that young, but I call him Young Daniel. That the numbers, that the votes that are being driven to this haven't arrived. So they got to arrive, and then they got to be counted, and then they'll be populating on computers. But until that happens, you know, the 10 o'clock news tonight, they'll be talking about waiting for numbers. So let's talk about what we have right now. Let's go back and we'll start to look at the mayor's numbers again. So for those of you just joining us to know where we are, there's 49% mirrors some of the early polling that was being done, both by the Houston Public Media and also University of Houston Hobby School. Showing the numbers that it showed. And I think Dwight Borkins has to be particularly disappointed if those numbers don't improve. I mean, clearly he's not going to make a runoff with those numbers. But there was those numbers. I know he was really counting on the firefighters' support to help him to get. But that just shows, you know, you can get firefighters to say we want to vote for you. But that shows how endorsements don't necessarily mean a thing going forward. Daniel, would you repeat what you were saying to me earlier, sir? Okay. Let's go ahead and continue on. Just so you know, even though you couldn't see the numbers there, we only see the top 4 numbers on our screen. But in terms of the numbers for mayor, beyond those folk who we were thinking were going to do maybe better, they were not doing better. Sue Lovell was only like 1%, and so that clearly was not something that she was anticipating. So you had. The top 4 were Turner, Busby, King, and Boykins was at 5.7. And then the next number was Sue Lovell at 1.05%. So, and then you have all these other folk who are polling as low as 1900s or 1400s. Now, Naful Hajami, 1400s of a percent. So when you have 12 people in there, that's kind of what happens here. So,
but what is, I've always wondered, and of course, having been around elections for a long time, not denigrating these other candidates at all.
Right.
But who votes for them? You know, you mentioned Miss Hujami. 154 people voted for Hujami. Why? I'd always be curious to go back and say, why?
Yeah.
You know, and I people who feel like they need to run to do their civic duty.
Yeah.
You know, when you have partisan elections, a Republican is going to run even though they know they got no shot. You know, I always thought when Adrian Garcia decided to run against Gene Green, I said, oh, okay. But Gene's like hammering people, you know, all the time, and then it didn't change when Adrian ran. I mean, Adrian, I know why, because of how the population, the demographic was. But sometimes you feel like this is just my civic duty. Yeah. But you're right, Hajami, when you get 10, 11 people and they don't have money and they know that the machine of the incumbent is there, it is a challenge. And I think a lot of it may have to do with maybe you have a position that you're wanting to, your business. Maybe you can improve your business by saying I was a mayoral candidate.
Well, earlier we were discussing Eric Dick. You know, for years he ran and he actually told some people, hey, it helps the law practice.
Yeah.
So some people do that.
By the way, Young Daniel is just amazing. This is the web page. It actually shows all those numbers of those early votes that we have coming in there going forward here. So we're going to continue to look at some of the other numbers that we have before we finish. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. I want to run through these. The city council votes. We have 108 people running, but let's just go through them quickly. At large, where Mike Knox is the incumbent, and he has been doing well. Doesn't look like but then you say because of what's happened here now with the early voting, that there's a chance that based upon Raj Sohotra at 21%, almost 22%, and because of, you said social media, young people like him a lot. He had almost $250,000 into his machine, if you will. Rice guy, Harvard guy, and so looks like he could make the runoff, or certainly would make the runoff based upon what we know.
That's one of those where, you know, Mike Knox is an incumbent. 38% may sound good because he's 17 points ahead, but if it ends up only 38% and you're an incumbent, that's not good.
Right.
That means 62% of the people didn't approve.
And you're seeing a lot of this in the city of Houston, that it's becoming more blue, and this is part of the evidence that makes that case.
All right, Daniel, I'm going to follow you now. So just go ahead and go through the city council numbers, and we'll just follow you as we go through finishing up this. Position 2, David Robinson, obviously the incumbent. Another scenario where if you're the incumbent, you probably want a higher number than that as you get ready to go into a runoff and run against whoever's going to be the next person in line, if you will. Michael Kubash is the incumbent in at-large 3, and it doesn't look like there's going to be a problem for him. The other folks in there, although you think that there might be some issues.
No, Michael is one of those people that also tends to cross party lines.
Right.
He has support, both Republican, Democrat. He has support among various demographics too,
Right.
which is kind of interesting.
Well, and he registers Republican, but he's able to do that. I mean, that's what the city registrar had him registered as.
Well, let's be clear. You don't register.
Well,
It's the primary he's voted in the past.
right. Okay.
So, but again, he does manage to cross lines, and he has
Let's
a lot of support.
let's say identifies as, maybe? No?
No, he votes in Republican primaries, or he has in the past.
Yeah, because that's one of the reasons I don't vote in primaries. I don't want to vote in any of them. Okay, at-large 4, because I am a strong independent. At-large 4, Anthony Dolcefino at 23%. This is a close one here. We get those day of numbers. When you wake up tomorrow morning, it's going to be a whole different scenario in terms of who's number 1 and going forward from that point. That's position 4. At-large 5, Jack Christie's not running, so they have 9 others running for that spot. And right now, it's Sally Alcorn with those first votes coming in, 24 to 21%, as we talked about Eric Dick in that race as well. District A, incumbent Brenda Stardick not running. So Amy Peck, who is her chief of staff, is there right now, and looks like she's in a good position to be able to win that one. Jerry Davis not running, and District B is in term limited. 14 people running in that. Tarsha Jackson now leading the way at this point with Renee Jefferson Smith. Of course, very early between Renee and Cynthia Bailey, so that's anybody's game there. District C, Ellen Cohen not running again. Abby Kamen, one of the folk who was expected to do well there, $200,000 raised in a district that's still got a lot going on there. Don't be swayed by the fact you see 32%. There's a lot that could happen there going forward. District D, Dwight Boykins, once he said he wasn't going to run, 15 people jumped in to run for that. And Carolyn Evans-Shabazz, HCC board chair, is leading in that one with the rest of the folk trying to come in and make headway. And that's another scenario where the day of voting could be a big, big difference. Dave Martin is going to win in District E once again. In District F, Steve Lee is not running, and there are 6 candidates in that district. Tiffany Thomas, who is endorsed by the Chronicle, is leading the way there, and there's several other people in that district. Very interesting district right now, changing and consistently changing each time around. Greg Travis, District G, the incumbent there, not going to have a problem going back. District H, Carla Cisneros is the incumbent there, and that one's not so clear-cut. 39% for her, 28%. Anything can happen there going forward there. District I, Robert Gallegos, not going to be a problem for him, incumbent. Going back again, 68%, or at least it appears to be that right now. District J, Mike Laster, not running, term limited. And this one is wide open as well, with Edward Pollard at this point, with Sandra Rodriguez trailing, and Barry Curtis there as well going forward. The District K, incumbent Martha Castix Tatum, and she is not going to have a problem getting reelected there. Seems to me, as we look over what's happening tonight, we know HISD, all of the incumbents who were a part of the, quote, scandal, the voters have sent a clear message, and so it can't be much more clear than that.
Yeah, I think before we wrap up, we have to say one thing. With Mayor Turner on the ballot, he has a turnout machine, and while he does cross all demographics, he has a big turnout machine in the African American community. If he wins without a runoff, that turnout machine is not going to be working for the runoff. Mm-hmm. So all these city council races are going to be different if Mayor Turner's in the runoff or if he's not in the runoff. And so that's going to be the fascinating thing for
Great point.
People like...
Yeah, and there are a bunch of people who are running who weren't so keen on endorsing Sylvester Turner, so you could see that play out in some of the runoffs for those where Turner may or may not help.
Right.
Well, we've been watching early voting numbers. They came in right at 7 o'clock, and that's all that's there right now. We've been told by Diane Troutman's office that the votes that are there, we should probably get some numbers in 30 minutes. Daniel, 30 minutes is as soon as we could expect early numbers. Ed, why are you laughing?
I'm laughing. Well, I've got to laugh, and I believe in the new system. I think we just all have to get used to it. This is not as critical as it sounds, but I remember poor old Stan Stannard, the county clerk, getting beat up mercilessly. Oh, where are the results? Why does it take so long to get the results? Guess what? It takes longer now, but it encourages people to vote, and I'm not being negative toward it, but it is funny that you can point fingers.
It encourages people to vote, and they're not voting. How about that? Dr. Rottinghouse, thank you so much.
Always a pleasure.
Judge, good to see you as always. Nice to get you off the tennis court, come in and talk politics. And all the other stuff.
It's dark. I don't like to play under the lights.
I know. I'd like to thank you both for being here. Appreciate you coming in. Thank you for joining us this election eve, or this election day, as we cover this November 2019 election. Our coverage continues on air at 10 o'clock. You can get election results all evening long once they start coming in a half an hour, right here on click2houston.com. Good night.